This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Caroline Morse. The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 11. Quote, O woe, O woeful, woeful, woeful day! Most lamentable day, most woeful day, that ever I did yet behold. O day, O day, O day, O hateful day! Never was seen so black a day as this. O woeful day, O woeful day! Shakespeare. End quote. The family at the Locusts had slept, or watched, through all the disturbances at the cottage of Birch, in perfect ignorance of their occurrence. The attacks of the Skinners were always made with so much privacy as to exclude the sufferers, not only from succour, but frequently, through a dread of future depredations, from the commiseration of their neighbours also. Additional duties had drawn the ladies from their pillows at an hour somewhat earlier than usual, and Captain Lawton, notwithstanding the sufferings of his body, had risen in compliance with a rule from which he never departed, of sleeping but 6 hours at a time. This was one of the few points in which the care of the human frame was involved, on which the trooper and the surgeon of horse were ever known to agree. The doctor had watched during the night by the side of the bed of Captain Singleton, without once closing his eyes. Occasionally he would pay a visit to the wounded Englishman, who, being more hurt in the spirit than in the flesh, tolerated the interruptions with a very ill grace, and once, for an instant, he ventured to steal softly to the bed of his obstinate comrade, and was near succeeding in obtaining a touch of his pulse, when a terrible oath, sworn by the trooper in a dream, startled the prudent surgeon, and warned him of a trite saying in the corps, that Captain Lawton always slept with one eye open. This group had assembled in one of the parlours as the sun made its appearance over the eastern hill, dispersing the columns of fog which had enveloped the lowland. Miss Peyton was looking from a window in the direction of the tenement of the pedlar, and was expressing a kind anxiety after the welfare of the sick man, when the person of Katy suddenly emerged from the dense covering of an earthly cloud, whose mists were scattering before the cheering rays of the sun, and was seen making hasty steps towards the Locusts. There was that in the air of the housekeeper which bespoke distress of an unusual nature, and the kind-hearted mistress of the Locusts opened the door of the room with the benevolent intention of soothing a grief that seemed so overwhelming. A nearer view of the disturbed features of the visitor confirmed Miss Peyton in her belief, and with the shock that gentle feelings ever experience at a sudden and endless separation from even the meanest of their associates, she said hastily, "Katy, is he gone?" "No, ma'am," replied the disturbed damsel with great bitterness. "He is not yet gone, but he may go as soon as he pleases now, for the worst is done. I do verily believe, Miss Peyton, they haven't so much as left him money enough to buy him another suit of clothes to cover his nakedness, and those he has on are none of the best, I can tell you." "How," exclaimed the other, astonished, "could any one have the heart to plunder a man in such distress?" "Hearts," repeated Katy, catching her breath. "Men like them have no bowels at all. Plunder and distress indeed! Why, ma'am, there were in the iron pot, in plain sight, 54 guineas of gold, besides what lay underneath, which I couldn't count without handling, and I didn't like to touch it, for they say that another's gold is apt to stick, so, judging from that in sight, there wasn't less than 200 guineas, besides what might have been in the deerskin purse. But Harvey is little better now than a beggar, and a beggar, Miss Jeanette, is the most awfully despisable of all earthly creatures." "Poverty is to be pitied, not despised," said the lady, still unable to comprehend the extent of the misfortune that had befallen her neighbour during the night. "But how is the old man, and how does this loss affect him much?" The countenance of Katy changed from the natural expression of concern to the set form of melancholy, as she answered, "He is happily removed from the cares of the world. The chinking of the money made him get out of his bed, and the poor soul found the shock too great for him. He died about 2 hours and 10 minutes before the cock crowed, as near as we can say." She was interrupted by the physician, who, approaching, inquired with much interest the nature of the disorder. Glancing her eye over the figure of this new acquaintance, Katy instinctively adjusted her dress, replied, "'Twas the troubles of the times and the loss of property that brought him down. He wasted from day to day, and all my care and anxiety were lost. For now Harvey is no better than a beggar, and who is there to pay me for what I have done?" "God will reward you for all the good you have done," said Miss Peyton mildly. "Yes," interrupted the spinster hastily, and with an air of reverence that was instantly succeeded by an expression that denoted more of worldly care. But then I have left my wages for 3 years past in the hands of Harvey, and how am I to get them? My brothers told me again and again to ask for my money, but I always thought accounts between relations were easily settled." "Were you related, then, to Birch?" asked Miss Peyton, observing her to pause. "Why," returned the housekeeper, hesitating a little, "I thought we were as good as so. I wonder if I have no claim on the house and garden, though they say, now it is Harvey's, it will surely be confiscated." Turning to Lawton, who had been sitting in one posture with his piercing eyes lowering at her through his thick brows, in silence, "Perhaps this gentleman knows. He seems to take an interest in my story." "Madame," said the trooper, bowing very low, "both you and the tale are extremely interesting." Katy smiled involuntarily. "But my humble knowledge is limited to the setting of a squadron in the field, and using it when there. I beg leave to refer you to Dr. Archibald Sitgreaves, a gentleman of universal attainments and unbounded philanthropy, the very milk of human sympathies, and a mortal foe to all indiscriminate cutting." The surgeon drew up and employed himself in whistling a low air, as he looked over some vials on a table; but the housekeeper, turning to him with an inclination of the head, continued, "I suppose, sir, a woman has no dower in her husband's property unless they be actually married." It was a maxim with Dr. Sitgreaves that no species of knowledge was to be despised, and consequently he was an empiric in everything but his profession. At first, indignation at the irony of his comrade kept him silent, but suddenly changing his purpose, he answered the applicant with a good-natured smile. "I judge not. If death has anticipated your nuptials, I'm fearful you have no remedy against his stern decrees." To Katy this sounded well, although she understood nothing of its meaning but death and nuptials. To this part of his speech then she directed her reply. "I did think he only waited the death of the old gentleman before he married," said the housekeeper, looking on the carpet. "But now he is nothing more than despisable, or, what's the same thing, a peddler without house-pack or money. It might be hard for a man to get a wife at all in such a predicary, don't you think it would, Miss Peyton?" "I seldom trouble myself with such things," said the lady gravely. During this dialogue, Captain Lawton had been studying the countenance and manner of the housekeeper with a most ludicrous gravity, and fearful the conversation would cease, he inquired with an appearance of great interest, "You think it was age and debility that removed the old gentleman at last?" "And the troublesome times. Trouble is a heavy pull-down to a sick bed. But I suppose his time had come, and when that happens it matters but little what doctor's stuff we take." "Let me set you right in that particular," interrupted the surgeon. "We must all die, it is true, but it is permitted us to use the lights of science in arresting dangers as they occur, until—" "We can die secundum artem," cried the trooper. To this observation the physician did not deign to reply, but deeming it necessary to his professional dignity that the conversation should continue, he added, "Perhaps in this instance judicious treatment might have prolonged the life of the patient. Who administered to the case?" "No one yet," said the housekeeper with quickness. "I expect he has made his last will and testament." The surgeon disregarded the smile of the ladies, and pursued his inquiries. "It is doubtless wise to be prepared for death, but under whose care was the sick man during his indisposition?" "Under mine," answered Katy, with an air of a little importance, "and care thrown away, I may well call it, for Harvey is quite too despisable to be any sort of compensation at present." The mutual ignorance of each other's meaning made very little interruption to the dialogue, for both took a good deal for granted, and Sitgreaves pursued the subject. "And how did you treat him?" "Kindly, you may be certain," said Katy, rather tartly. "The doctor means medically, madame," observed Captain Lawton, with a face that would have honored the funeral of the deceased. "I doctored him mostly with yarbs," said the housekeeper, smiling, as if conscious of error. "With simples," returned the surgeon. "They are safer in the hands of the unlettered than more powerful remedies. But why had you no regular attendant?" "I'm sure Harvey has suffered enough already from having so much concerns with the rig'lars," replied the housekeeper. "He has lost his all, and made himself a vagabond through the land, and I have reason to rue the day I ever crossed the threshold of his house." "Dr. Sitgreaves does not mean a regular soldier, but a regular physician, madame," said the trooper. "Oh!" cried the maiden, again correcting herself, "for the best of all reasons. There was none to be had, so I took care of him myself. If there had been a doctor at hand, I'm sure we would have gladly had him. For my part, I am clear for doctoring, though Harvey says I am killing myself with medicines. But I am sure it will make but little difference to him whether I live or die." "Therein you show your sense," said the surgeon, approaching the spinster, who sat holding the palms of her hands and the soles of her feet to the genial heat of a fine fire, making the most of comfort amid all her troubles. "You appear to be a sensible, discreet woman, and some who have had opportunities of acquiring more correct views might envy you your respect for knowledge and the lights of science." Although the housekeeper did not altogether comprehend the other's meaning, she knew he used a compliment, and as such was highly pleased with what he said. With increasing animation, therefore, she cried, "It was always said of me that I wanted nothing but opportunity to make quite a physician myself, so long as before I came to live with Harvey's father they called me the petticoat doctor." "More true than civil, I dare say," returned the surgeon, losing sight of the woman's character in his admiration of her respect for the healing art. In the absence of more enlightened counselors, the experience of a discreet matron is frequently of great efficacy in checking the progress of disease. Under such circumstances, madame, it is dreadful to have to contend with ignorance and obstinacy." "Bad enough, as well I know from experience," cried Katy, in triumph. "Harvey is as obstinate about such things as a dumb beast. One would think the care I took of his bedridden father might learn him better than to despise good nursing. But some day he may know what it is to want a careful woman in his house, though now I am sure he is too despisable himself to have a house." "Indeed, I can easily comprehend the mortification you must have felt in having one so self-willed to deal with," returned the surgeon, glancing his eyes reproachfully at his comrade. "But you should rise superior to such opinions, and pity the ignorance by which they are engendered." The housekeeper hesitated a moment, at a loss to comprehend all that the surgeon expressed, yet she felt it was both complimentary and kind. Therefore, suppressing her natural flow of language a little, she replied, "I tell Harvey his conduct is often condemnable, and last night he made my words good. But the opinions of such unbelievers is not very consequential, yet it is dreadful to think how he behaves at times. Now, when he threw away the needle—" "What!" said the surgeon, interrupting her, "does he affect to despise the needle? But it is my lot to meet with men daily who are equally perverse, and who show a still more culpable disrespect for the information that flows from the lights of science." The doctor turned his face toward Captain Lawton while speaking, but the elevation of the head prevented his eyes from resting on the grave countenance maintained by the trooper. Katy listened with admiring attention, and when the other had done, she added, "Then Harvey is a disbeliever in the tides." "Not believe in the tides!" repeated the healer of bodies in astonishment. "Does the man distrust his senses? But perhaps it is the influence of the moon that he doubts." "That he does!" exclaimed Katy, shaking with delight at meeting a man of learning who could support her opinions. "If you was to hear him talk, you would think he didn't believe there was such a thing as a moon at all." "It is the misfortune of ignorance and incredulity, madame, that they feed themselves. The mind, once rejecting useful information, insensibly leans to superstition, and concludes on the order of nature that are not less prejudicial to the cause of truth than they are at variance with the first principles of human knowledge." The spinster was too much awestruck to venture an undigested reply to this speech, and the surgeon, after pausing a moment in a kind of philosophical disdain, continued, "That any man in his senses can doubt of the flux of the tides is more than I could have thought possible. Yet obstinacy is a dangerous inmate to harbor, and may lead us into any error, however gross." "You think, then, that they have an effect on the flux?" said the housekeeper, inquiringly. Miss Peyton rose and beckoned her nieces to give her their assistance in the adjoining pantry, while for a moment the dark visage of the attentive Lawton was lighted by an animation that vanished by an effort as powerful and sudden as the one that drew it into being. After reflecting whether he rightly understood the meaning of the other, the surgeon, making due allowance for the love of learning, acted upon a want of education, replied, "The moon, you mean. Many philosophers have doubted how far it affects the tides, but I think it is wilfully rejecting the lights of science not to believe it causes both the flux and reflux." As reflux was a disorder with which Katy was not acquainted, she thought it prudent to be silent, yet burning with curiosity to know the meaning of certain portentous lights to which the other so often alluded, she ventured to ask, "If them lights he spoke of were what was called northern lights in these parts?" In charity to her ignorance, the surgeon would have entered into an elaborate explanation of his meaning, had he not been interrupted by the mirth of Lawton. The trooper had listened so far with great composure, but now he laughed until his aching bones reminded him of his fall, and the tears rolled off his cheeks in larger drops than had ever been seen there before. At length the offended physician seized an opportunity of a pause to say, "To you, Captain Lawton, it may be a source of triumph that an uneducated woman should make a mistake in a subject on which men of science have long been at variance, but yet you find this respectable matron does not reject the lights, does not reject the use of proper instruments in repairing injuries sustained by the human frame. You may possibly remember, sir, her allusion to the use of a needle." "Aye," cried the delighted trooper, "to mend the peddler's breeches." Katy drew up in evident displeasure, and prompt to vindicate her character for more lofty acquirements, she said, "'Twas not a common use that I put that needle to, but one of much greater virtue." "Explain yourself, madame," said the surgeon impatiently, "that this gentleman may see how little reason he has for exultation." Thus solicited, Katy paused to collect sufficient eloquence to garnish her narrative. The substance of her tale was, that a child who had been placed by the guardians of the poor in the keeping of Harvey had, in the absence of its master, injured itself badly in the foot by a large needle. The offending instrument had been carefully greased, wrapped in woolen, and placed in a certain charmed nook of the chimney, while the foot, from a fear of weakening the incantation, was left in a state of nature. The arrival of the peddler had altered the whole of this admirable treatment, and the consequences were expressed by Katy as she concluded her narrative by saying, "'Twas no wonder the boy died of a lockjaw." Dr. Sitgreaves looked out of the window in admiration of the brilliant morning, striving all he could do to avoid the basilisk's eyes of his comrade. He was impelled by a feeling that he could not conquer, however, to look Captain Lawton in the face. The trooper had arranged every muscle of his countenance to express sympathy for the fate of the poor child, but the exultation of his eyes cut the astounding man of science to the quick. He muttered something concerning the condition of his patients, and retreated with precipitation. Miss Peyton entered into the situation of things at the house of the peddler, with all the interest of her excellent feelings. She listened patiently while Katy recounted, more particularly, the circumstances of the past night as they had occurred. The spinster did not forget to dwell on the magnitude of the pecuniary loss sustained by Harvey, and in no manner spared her invectives at his betraying a secret which might so easily have been kept. "For Miss Peyton," continued the housekeeper, after a pause to take breath, "I would have given up life before I would have given up that secret. At the most, they could only have killed him, and now a body may say that they have slain both soul and body, or what's the same thing, they have made him a despisable vagabond. I wonder who he thinks would be his wife, or who would keep his house. For my part, my good name is too precious to be living with a lone man, though for the matter of that he is never there. I am resolved to tell him this day, that stay there as a single woman I will not, an hour after the funeral, and marry him I don't think I will, unless he becomes steadier and more of a homebody." The mild mistress of the Locusts suffered the exuberance of the housekeeper's feelings to expend itself, and then, by one or two judicious questions that denoted a more intimate knowledge of the windings of the human heart in matters of Cupid than might fairly be supposed to belong to a spinster, she extracted enough from Katy to discover the improbability of Harvey's ever presuming to offer himself, with his broken fortunes, to the acceptance of Catherine Haynes. She therefore mentioned her own want of assistance in the present state of her household, and expressed a wish that Katy would change her residence to the Locusts, in case the peddler had no further use for her services. After a few preliminary conditions on the part of the wary housekeeper, the arrangement was concluded, and making a few more piteous lamentations on the weight of her own losses and the stupidity of Harvey, united with some curiosity to know the future fate of the peddler, Katy withdrew to make the necessary preparations for the approaching funeral, which was to take place that day. During the interview between the two females, Lawton, through delicacy, had withdrawn. Anxiety took him to the room of Captain Singleton. The character of this youth, it has already been shown, endeared him in a peculiar manner to every officer in the corps. The singularly mild deportment of the young dragoon had on so many occasions been proved not to proceed from want of resolution, that his almost feminine softness of manner and appearance had failed to bring him into disrepute even in that band of partisan warriors. To the major he was as dear as a brother, and his easy submission to the directions of his surgeon had made him a marked favorite with Dr. Sitgreaves. The rough usage the corps often received in its daring attacks had brought each of its officers in succession under the temporary keeping of the surgeon. To Captain Singleton the man of science had decreed the palm of docility on such occasions, and Captain Lawton he had fairly blackballed. He frequently declared, with unconquerable simplicity and earnestness of manner, that it gave him more pleasure to see the former brought in wounded than any officer in the squadron, and that the latter afforded him the least; a compliment and condemnation that were usually received by the first of the parties with a quiet smile of good nature, and by the last with a grave bow of thanks. On the present occasion the mortified surgeon and exulting trooper met in the room of Captain Singleton as a place where they could act on common ground. Some time was occupied in joint attentions to the comfort of the wounded officer, and the doctor retired to an apartment prepared for his own accommodation. Here, within a few minutes, he was surprised by the entrance of Lawton. The triumph of the trooper had been so complete that he felt he could afford to be generous, and commencing by voluntarily throwing aside his coat, he cried carelessly, Sitgreaves, administer a little of the aid of the lights of science to my body, if you please." The surgeon was beginning to feel that this was a subject that was intolerable, but venturing a glance toward his comrade, he saw with surprise the preparations he had made, and an air of sincerity about him that was unusual to his manner when making such a request. Changing his intended burst of resentment to a tone of civil inquiry, he said, "Does Captain Lawton want anything at my hands?" "Look for yourself, my dear sir," said the trooper mildly. "Here seems to be most of the colors of the rainbow on this shoulder." "You have reason for saying so," said the other, handling the part with great tenderness and consummate skill, "but happily nothing is broken. It is wonderful how well you escaped." "I have been a tumbler from my youth, and I am past minding a few falls from a horse. But Sitgreaves," he added with affection, and pointing to a scar on his body, "do you remember this bit of work?" "Perfectly well, Jack. It was bravely obtained and neatly extracted. But don't you think I had better apply an oil to these bruises?" "Certainly," said Lawton, with unexpected condescension. "Now, my dear boy," cried the doctor exultantly, as he busied himself in applying the remedy to the hurts, "do you not think it would have been better to have done all this last night?" "Quite probable." "Yes, Jack, but if you had let me perform the operation of phlebotomy when I first saw you, it would have been of infinite service." "No phlebotomy," said the other positively. "It is now too late, but a dose of oil would carry off the humours famously." To this the captain made no reply, but grated his teeth, in a way that showed the fortress of his mouth was not to be assailed without a resolute resistance, and the experienced physician changed the subject by saying, "It is a pity, John, that you did not catch the rascal after the danger and trouble you incurred." The captain of dragoons made no reply, and while placing some bandages on the wounded soldier, the surgeon continued, "If I have any wish at all to destroy human life, it is to have the pleasure of seeing that traitor hanged." "I thought your business was to cure and not to slay," said the trooper dryly. "Ay, but he has caused us such heavy losses by his information that I sometimes feel a very unsophistical temper towards that spy." "You should not encourage such feelings of animosity to any of your fellow creatures," returned Lawton, in a tone that caused the operator to drop a pin he was arranging in the bandages from his hand. He looked the patient in the face to remove all doubts of his identity. Finding, however, it was his old comrade, Captain John Lawton, who had spoken, he rallied his astonished faculties and proceeded by saying, "Your doctrine is just, and in general I subscribe to it. But, John, my dear fellow, is the bandage easy?" "Quite." "I agree with you as a whole, but as matter is infinitely divisible, so no case exists without an exception. Lawton, do you feel easy?" "Very." "It is not only cruel to the sufferer, but sometimes unjust to others, to take human life where a less punishment would answer the purpose. Now, Jack, if you were only— move your arm a little— if you were only— I hope you feel easier, my dear friend?" "Much." "If, my dear John, you would teach your men to cut with more discretion, it would answer you the same purpose, and give me great pleasure." The doctor drew a heavy sigh, as he was enabled to get rid of what was nearest to his heart, and the dragoon coolly replaced his coat, saying with great deliberation as he retired, "I know no troop that cut more judiciously. They generally shave from the crown to the jaw." The disappointed operator collected his instruments, and with a heavy heart proceeded to pay a visit to the room of Colonel Wellmere. End of Chapter 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Caroline Morse. The Spy, by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 12. Quote, "This fairy form contains a soul as mighty as that which lives within a giant's frame. These slender limbs, that tremble like the aspen at summer's eve sigh, uphold a spirit which roused can tower to the height of heaven, and light those shining windows of the face with much of heaven's own radiance." Duo. Unquote. The number and character of her guests had greatly added to the cares of Miss Jeanette Peyton. The morning found them all restored, in some measure, to their former ease of body, with the exception of the youthful captain of dragoons, who had been so deeply regretted by Dunwoodie. The wound of this officer was severe, though the surgeon persevered in saying that it was without danger. His comrade, we have shown, had deserted his couch, and Henry Wharton awoke from a sleep that had been undisturbed by anything but a dream of suffering amputation under the hands of a surgical novice. As it proved, however, to be nothing but a dream, the youth found himself much refreshed by his slumbers, and Dr. Sitgreaves removed all further apprehensions by confidently pronouncing that he would be a well man within a fortnight. During all this time Colonel Wellmere did not make an appearance. He breakfasted in his own room, and notwithstanding certain significant smiles of the man of science, declared himself much too injured to rise from his bed. Leaving him, therefore, endeavouring to conceal his chagrin in the solitude of his chamber, the surgeon proceeded to the more grateful task of sitting an hour by the bedside of George Singleton. A slight flush was on the face of the patient as the doctor entered the room, and the latter advanced promptly and laid his fingers on the pulse of the youth, beckoning to him to be silent, while he muttered, "Growing symptoms of a febrile pulse. No, no, my dear George, you must remain quiet and dumb, though your eyes look better, and your skin has even a moisture." "Nay, my dear Sitgreaves," said the youth, taking his hand, "you see there is no fever about me. Look, is there any of Jack Lawton's hoarfrost on my tongue?" "No, indeed," said the surgeon, clapping a spoon in the mouth of the other, forcing it open, and looking down his throat as if disposed to visit the interior in person. "The tongue is well, and the pulse begins to lower again. Ah, the bleeding did you good. Phlebotomy is a sovereign specific for southern constitutions, but that madcap Lawton absolutely refused to be blooded for a fall he had from a horse last night. Why, George, your case is becoming singular," continued the doctor, instinctively throwing aside his wig. "Your pulse even and soft, your skin moist, but your eye fiery, and cheek flushed. Oh, I must examine more closely into these symptoms." "Softly, my good friend, softly," said the youth, falling back on his pillow, and losing some of that colour which alarmed his companion. "I believe in extracting the ball you did for me all that is required. I am free from pain, and only weak, I do assure you." "Captain Singleton," said the surgeon with heat, "it is presumptuous in you to pretend to tell your medical attendant when you are free from pain, if it be not to enable us to decide in such matters of what avail the lights of science. For shame, George, for shame. Even that perverse fellow John Lawton could not behave with more obstinacy." His patient smiled, as he gently repulsed his physician in an attempt to undo the bandages, and with a returning glow to his cheeks inquired, "Do, Archibald," a term of endearment that seldom failed to soften the operator's heart, "tell me what spirit from heaven has been gliding around my apartment while I lay pretending to be asleep." "If anyone interferes with my patients," cried the doctor hastily, "I will teach them, spirit or no spirit, what it is to meddle with another man's concerns." "Tut, my dear fellow, there was no interference made, nor any intended. See," exhibiting the bandages, "everything is as you left it, but it glided about the room with the grace of a fairy and the tenderness of an angel." The surgeon, having satisfied himself that everything was as he left it, very deliberately resumed his seat and replaced his wig, as he inquired with a brevity that would have honoured Lieutenant Mason, "Had it petticoats, George?" "I saw nothing but its heavenly eyes, its bloom, its majestic step, its grace," replied the young man, with rather more ardour than his surgeon thought consistent with his debilitated condition, and he laid his hand on his mouth to stop himself, saying, "It must have been Miss Jeanette Peyton, a lady of fine accomplishments, with with something of the kind of step you speak of, a very complacent eye, and as to the bloom, I dare say offices of charity can summon as fine a colour to her cheeks as glows in the faces of her more youthful nieces." "Nieces? Has she nieces, then? The angel I saw may be a daughter, a sister, or a niece, but never an aunt." "Hush, George, hush. Your talking has brought your pulse up again. You must observe quiet, and prepare for a meeting with your own sister, who will be here within an hour." "What, Isabella? And who sent for her?" "The Major." "Consider it, Dunwoodie," murmured the exhausted youth, sinking again on his pillow, where the commands of his attendant compelled him to remain silent. Even Captain Lawton had been received with many and courteous inquiries after the state of his health, from all the members of the family, when he made his morning entrance, but an invisible spirit presided over the comforts of the English colonel. Sarah had shrunk with consciousness from entering the room, yet she knew the position of every glass, and had with her own hands supplied the contents of every bowl that stood on his table. At the time of our tale we were a divided people, and Sarah thought it was no more than her duty to cherish the institutions of that country to which she yet clung as the land of her forefathers, but there were other and more cogent reasons for the silent preference she was giving to the Englishman. His image had first filled the void in her youthful fancy, and it was an image that was distinguished by many of those attractions that can enchain a female heart. It is true he wanted the personal excellence of Peyton Dunwoodie, but his pretensions were far from contemptible. Sarah had moved about the house during the morning, casting frequent and longing glances at the door of Wellmere's apartment, anxious to learn the condition of his wounds, and yet ashamed to inquire. Conscious interest kept her tongue tied, until her sister, with the frankness of innocence, had put the desired question to Dr. Sitgreaves. "Colonel Wellmere," said the operator gravely, "is in what I call a state of free will, madame. He is ill, or he is well, as he pleases. His case, young lady, exceeds my art to heal, and I take it Sir Henry Clinton is the best adviser he can apply to, though Major Dunwoodie has made the communication with his leech rather difficult." Frances smiled, but averted her face, while Sarah moved, with the grace of an offended Juno, from the apartment. Her own room, however, afforded her but little relief, and in passing through the long gallery that communicated with each of the chambers of the building, she noticed the door of Singleton's room to be open. The wounded youth seemed sleeping, and was alone. She had ventured lightly into the apartment, busied herself for a few minutes in arranging the tables, and the nourishment provided for the patient, hardly conscious of what she was doing, and possibly dreaming that these little feminine offices were performed for another. Her natural bloom was heightened by the insinuation of the surgeon, nor was the lustre of her eye in any degree diminished. The sound of the approaching footsteps of Sitgreaves hastened her retreat down a private stairway to the side of her sister. The sisters then sought the fresh air on the piazza, and as they pursued their walk arm in arm, the following dialogue took place. "There is something disagreeable about this surgeon of Dunwoody," said Sarah, "that causes me to wish him away most heartily." Frances fixed her laughing eyes on her sister, but forbearing to speak, the other readily construed their expression, and hastily added, "But I forget he is one of your renowned corps of Virginians, and must be spoken of reverently." "As respectfully as you please, my dear sister. There is but little danger of exceeding the truth." "Not in your opinion," said the elder with little warmth, "but I think Mr. Dunwoody has taken a liberty that exceeds the rights of consanguinity. He has made our father's house a hospital. We ought to be grateful that none of the patients it contains are dearer to us. Your brother is one." "True, true," interrupted Frances, blushing to the eyes, "but he leaves his room, and thinks his wound lightly purchased by the pleasure of being with his friends. If," she added with a tremulous lip, "this dreadful suspicion that is affixed to his visit were removed, I could consider his wound of little moment. You now have the fruits of rebellion brought home to you, a brother wounded and a prisoner, and perhaps a victim, your father distressed, his privacy interrupted, and not improbably his estates torn from him on account of his loyalty to his king." Frances continued her walk in silence. While facing the northern entrance to the vale, her eyes were uniformly fastened on the point where the road was suddenly lost by the intervention of a hill, and at each turn, as she lost sight of the spot, she lingered, until an impatient movement of her sister quickened her pace to an even motion with that of her own. At length a single horse-chaise was seen making its way carefully among the stones which lay scattered over the country road that wound through the valley and approached the cottage. The colour of Frances changed as the vehicle gradually drew nearer, and when she was enabled to see a female form in it by the side of a black in livery, her limbs shook with an agitation that compelled her to lean on Sarah for support. In a few minutes the travellers approached the gate. It was thrown open by a dragoon who followed the carriage, and who had been the messenger dispatched by Dunwoody to the father of Captain Singleton. Miss Peyton advanced to receive their guest, and the sisters united in giving her the kindest welcome. Still Frances could with difficulty withdraw her truant eyes from the countenance of their visitor. She was young, and of a light and fragile form, but of exquisite proportions. Her eyes were large, full, black, piercing, and at times a little wild. Her hair was luxuriant, and as it was without the powder it was then the fashion to wear, it fell in raven blackness. A few of its locks had fallen on her cheek, giving its chilling whiteness by the contrast a more deadly character. Dr. Sitgreaves supported her from the chaise, and when she gained the floor of the piazza she turned an expressive look on the face of the practitioner. "Your brother is out of danger and wishes to see you, Miss Singleton," said the surgeon. The lady burst into a flood of tears. Frances had stood contemplating the action and face of Isabella with a kind of uneasy admiration, but she now sprang to her side with the ardour of a sister, and kindly drawing her arm within her own, led the way to a retired room. The movement was so ingenuous, so considerate, and so delicate, that even Miss Peyton withheld her interference, following the youthful pair with only her eyes and a smile of complacency. The feeling was communicated to all the spectators, and they dispersed in pursuit of their usual avocations. Isabella yielded to the gentle influence of Frances without resistance, and having gained the room where the latter conducted her, wept in silence on the shoulder of the observant and soothing girl, until Frances thought her tears exceeded the emotion natural to the occasion. The sobs of Miss Singleton for a time were violent and uncontrollable, until, with an evident exertion, she yielded to a kind observation of her companion, and succeeded in suppressing her tears. Raising her face to the eyes of Frances, she rose, while a smile of beautiful radiance passed over her features, and making a hasty apology for the excess of her emotion, she desired to be conducted to the room of the invalid. The meeting between the brother and sister was warm, but, by an effort on the part of the lady, more composed than her previous agitation had given reason to expect. Isabella found her brother looking better and in less danger than her sensitive imagination had led her to suppose. Her spirits rose in proportion. From despondency she passed to something like gaiety. Her beautiful eyes sparkled with renovated brilliancy, and her face was lighted with smiles so fascinating that Frances, who, in compliance with her earnest entreaties, had accompanied her to the sick-chamber, sat gazing on a countenance that possessed so wonderful variability, impelled by a charm that was beyond her control. The youth had thrown an earnest look at Frances, as soon as his sister raised herself from his arms, and perhaps it was the first glance at the lovely lineaments of our heroine, when the gazer turned his eyes from the view in disappointment. He seemed bewildered, rubbed his forehead like a man awaking from a dream, and mused. "Where is Dunwoodie, Isabella?" he said. "The excellent fellow is never weary of kind actions. After a day of such service as that of yesterday, he has spent the night in bringing me a nurse whose presence alone is able to raise me from my couch." The expression of the lady's countenance changed. Her eye roved around the apartment with a character of wildness in it that repelled the anxious Frances, who studied her movements with unabated interest. "Dunwoodie! Is he not here, then? I thought to have met him by the side of my brother's bed." "He has duties that require his presence elsewhere. The English are said to be out by the way of the Hudson, and they give us light troops but little rest. Surely nothing else could have kept him so long from a wounded friend. But, Isabella, the meeting has been too much for you. You tremble." Isabella made no reply. She stretched her hand toward the table which held the nourishment of the captain, and the attentive Frances comprehended her wishes in a moment. A glass of water in some measure revived the sister, who was enabled to say, "Doubtless it is his duty. 'Twas said above, a royal party was moving on the river, though I passed the troops but 2 miles from this spot." The latter part of the sentence was hardly audible, and it was spoken more in the manner of a soliloquy than as if for the ears of her companions. "On the march, Isabella?" eagerly inquired her brother. "No, dismounted and seemingly at rest," was the reply. The wondering dragoon turned his gaze on the countenance of his sister, who sat with her eye bent on the carpet in unconscious absence, but found no explanation. His look was changed to the face of Frances, who, startled by the earnestness of his expression, arose, and hastily inquired if he would have any assistance. "If you can pardon the rudeness," said the wounded officer, making a feeble effort to raise his body, "I would request to have Captain Lawton's company for a moment." Frances hastened instantly to communicate his wish to that gentleman, and, impelled by an interest she could not control, she returned again to her seat by the side of Miss Singleton. "Lawton," said the youth impatiently as the trooper entered, "hear you from the major." The eye of the sister was now bent on the face of the trooper, who made his salutations to the lady with ease, blended with the frankness of a soldier. "His man has been here twice," he said, "to inquire how we fared in the lazaretto." "And why not himself?" "That is a question the major can answer best, but you know the redcoats are abroad, and Dunwoodie commands in the county. These English must be looked to." "True," said Singleton slowly, as if struck with the other's reasons. "But how is it that you are idle when there is work to do?" "My sword arm is not in the best condition, and Roanoke has but a shambling gait this morning. Besides, there is another reason I could mention, if it were not that Miss Wharton would never forgive me." "Speak, I beg, without dread of my displeasure," said Frances, returning the good-humoured smile of the trooper with the archness natural to her own sweet face. "The odours of your kitchen, then," cried Lawton bluntly, "forbid my quitting the domains until I qualify myself to speak with more certainty concerning the fatness of the land." "Oh, Aunt Jeanette is exerting herself to do credit to my father's hospitality," said the laughing girl, "and I am a truant from her labours, as I shall be a stranger to her favour unless I proffer my assistance." Frances withdrew to seek her aunt, musing deeply on the character and extreme sensibility of the new acquaintance chance had brought to the cottage. The wounded officer followed her with his eyes, as she moved, with infantile grace, through the door of his apartment, and as she vanished from his view, he observed, "Such an aunt and niece are seldom to be met with, Jack. This seems a fairy, but the aunt is angelic. You are doing well, I see. Your enthusiasm for the sex holds its own. I should be ungrateful as well as insensible did I not bear testimony to the loveliness of Miss Peyton. A good motherly lady, but as to love, that is a matter of taste. A few years younger, with deference to her prudence and experience, would accord better with my fancy." "She must be under 20, said the other quickly. "It depends on the way you count. If you begin at the heel of life, well, but if you reckon downward, as is most common, I think she is nearer 40. "You have mistaken an elder sister for the aunt," said Isabella, laying her fair hand on the mouth of the invalid. "You must be silent. Your feelings are beginning to affect your frame." The entrance of Dr. Sitgreaves, who, in some alarm, noticed the increase of feverish symptoms in his patient, enforced this mandate, and the trooper withdrew to pay a visit of condolence to Roanoke, who had been an equal sufferer with himself in their last night's somersault. To his great joy, his man pronounced the steed to be equally convalescent with the master, and Lawton found that by dint of rubbing the animal's limbs several hours without ceasing, he was enabled to place his feet in what he called systematic motion. Orders were accordingly given to be in readiness to rejoin the troop at the Four Corners as soon as his master had shared in the bounty of the approaching banquet. In the meantime Henry Wharton entered the apartment of Wellmere, and by his sympathy succeeded in restoring the colonel to his own good graces. The latter was consequently enabled to rise, and prepared to meet a rival of whom he had spoken so lightly, as the result had proved, with so little reason. Wharton knew that their misfortune, as they both termed their defeat, was owing to the other's rashness, but he forbore to speak of anything except the unfortunate accident which had deprived the English of their leader, and to which he good-naturedly ascribed their subsequent discomfiture. "In short, Wharton," said the colonel, putting one leg out of bed, "it may be called a combination of untoward events. Your own ungovernable horse prevented my orders from being carried to the major, in season to flank the rebels." "Very true," replied the captain, kicking a slipper toward the bed. "Had we succeeded in getting a few good fires upon them in flank, we should have sent these brave Virginians to the right about." "Ay, and that in double quick time," cried the colonel, making the other leg follow its companion. "Then it was necessary to rout the guides, you know, and the movement gave them the best possible opportunity to charge." "Yes," said the other, sending the second slipper after the first, "and this Major Dunwoodie never overlooks an advantage." "I think if we had the thing to do over again," continued the colonel, raising himself on his feet, "we might alter the case very materially, though the chief thing the rebels have now to boast of is my capture. They were repulsed, you saw, in their attempt to drive us from the wood." "At least they would have been had they made an attack," said the captain, throwing the rest of his clothes within reach of the colonel. "Why, that is the same thing," returned Wellmere, beginning to dress himself. "To assume such an attitude as to intimidate the enemy is the chief art of war." "Doubtlessly, then, you may remember in one of their charges they were completely routed." "True, true," cried the colonel with animation. "Had I been there to have improved that advantage, we might have turned the table on the Yankees." Saying which, he displayed still greater animation in completing his toilet, and he was soon prepared to make his appearance, fully restored to his own good opinion, and fairly persuaded that his capture was owing to casualties absolutely beyond the control of man. The knowledge that Colonel Wellmere was to be guest at the table in no degree diminished the preparations which were already making for the banquet, and Sarah, after receiving the compliments of the gentleman, and making many kind inquiries after the state of his wounds, proceeded in person to lend her counsel and taste to one of those laboured entertainments which at that day were so frequent in country life, and which are not entirely banished from our domestic economy at the present moment. Chapter 12. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Caroline Morse. The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 13. Quote, "I will stand to and feed, although my last." Tempest. End quote. The savour of preparation which had been noticed by Captain Lawton began to increase within the walls of the cottage. Certain sweet-smelling odours, that arose from the subterranean territories of Caesar, gave to the trooper the most pleasing assurances that his olfactory nerves, which on such occasions were as acute as his eyes on others, had faithfully performed their duty, and for the benefit of enjoying the passing sweets as they arose, the dragoon so placed himself at a window of the building that not a vapour charged with the spices of the East could exhale on its passage to the clouds, without first giving its incense to his nose. Lawton, however, by no means indulged himself in this comfortable arrangement, without first making such preparations to do meet honour to the feast as his scanty wardrobe would allow. The uniform of his corps was always a passport to the best tables, and this, though somewhat tarnished by faithful service and unceremonious usage, was properly brushed and decked out for the occasion. His head, which nature had ornamented with the blackness of a crow, now shone with the whiteness of snow, and his bony hand, that so well became the sabre, peered from beneath a ruffle with something like maiden coyness. The improvements of the dragoon went no further, except that his boots shone with more than holiday splendour, and his spurs glittered in the rays of the sun, as became the pure ore of which they were composed. Caesar moved through the apartments with a face charged with an importance exceeding even that which had accompanied him in his melancholy task of the morning. The black had early returned from the errand on which he had been dispatched by the pedlar, and, obedient to the commands of his mistress, promptly appeared to give his services where his allegiance was due. So serious indeed was his duty now becoming, that it was only at odd moments he was able to impart to his sable brother, who had been sent in attendance on Miss Singleton to the Locusts, any portion of the wonderful incidents of the momentous night he had so lately passed. By ingeniously using, however, such occasions as accidentally offered, Caesar communicated so many of the heads of his tale as served to open the eyes of his visitor to their fullest width. The gusto for the marvellous was innate in these sable worthies, and Miss Peyton found it necessary to interpose her authority in order to postpone the residue of the history to a more befitting opportunity. "Ah, Miss Jeanette," said Caesar, shaking his head and looking all that he expressed, "'twas awful to see Johnny Birch walk on a feet when he lie dead." This concluded the conversation, though the black promised himself the satisfaction, and did not fail to enjoy it, of having many a gossip on the subject at a future period. The ghost thus happily laid, the department of Miss Peyton flourished, and by the time the afternoon's sun had travelled a 2 hours' journey from the meridian, the formal procession from the kitchen to the parlour commenced, under the auspices of Caesar, who led the van, supporting a turkey on the palms of his withered hands, with the dexterity of a balanced master. Next followed the servant of Captain Lawton, bearing, as he marched stiffly and walking wide, as if allowing room for his steed, a ham of true Virginian flavour, a present from the spinster's brother in a comic. The supporter of this savoury dish kept his eye on his trust with military precision, and by the time he reached his destination it might be difficult to say which contained the most juice, his own mouth or the acomic bacon. Third in line was to be seen the valet of Colonel Wellmere, who carried in either hand chickens fricasseed and oyster patties. After him marched the attendant of Dr. Sitgreaves, who had instinctively seized an enormous tureen, as most resembling matters he understood, and followed on in place until the steams of the soup so completely bedimmed the spectacles he wore as a badge of office, that, on arriving at the scene of action, he was compelled to deposit his freight on the floor until, by removing the glasses, he could see his way through the pile of reserved china and plate-warmers. Next followed another trooper, whose duty it was to attend on Captain Singleton, and as if apportioning his appetite to the feeble state of his master, he had contented himself with conveying a pair of ducks, roasted, until their tempting fragrance began to make him repent his having so lately demolished a breakfast that had been provided for his master's sister, with another prepared for himself. The white boy, who belonged to the house, brought up the rear, groaning under a load of sundry dishes of vegetables that the cook, by way of climax, had unwittingly heaped on him. But this was far from all of the preparations for that day's feast. Caesar had no sooner deposited his bird, which, but the week before, had been flying amongst the highlands of Dutchess, little dreaming of so soon heading such a goodly assemblage, than he turned mechanically on his heel and took up his line of march again for the kitchen. In this evolution the black was imitated by his companions in succession, and another procession to the parlour followed in the same order. By this admirable arrangement, whole flocks of pigeons, certain bevies of quails, shoals of flatfish, bass, and sundry woodcock found their way into the presence of the company. A third attack brought suitable quantities of potatoes, onions, beets, cold slaw, rice, and all the other minutiae of a goodly dinner. The board now fairly groaned with American profusion, and Caesar, glancing his eye over the show with a most approving conscience, after readjusting every dish that had not been placed on the table with his own hands, proceeded to acquaint the mistress of the revels that his task was happily accomplished. Some half-hour before the culinary array just recorded took place, all the ladies disappeared, much in the same unaccountable manner that swallows flee the approach of winter. But the spring-time of their return had arrived, and the whole party were collected in an apartment that, in consequence of its containing no side-table, and being furnished with a chintz coverlet settee, was termed a withdrawing-room. The kind-hearted spinster had deemed the occasion worthy, not only of extraordinary preparations in the culinary department, but had seen proper to deck her own person in garments suited to the guests whom it was now her happiness to entertain. On her head Miss Peyton wore a cap of exquisite lawn, which was ornamented in front with a broad border of lace, that spread from the face in such a manner as to admit of a display of artificial flowers clustered in a group on the summit of her fine forehead. The colour of her hair was lost in the profusion of powder with which it was covered, but a slight curling of the extremities in some degree relieved the formality of its arrangement, and gave a look of feminine softness to the features. Her dress was a rich, heavy silk of violet colour, cut low around the bust, with a stomacher of the same material, that fitted close to the figure, and exhibited the form, from the shoulders to the waist, in its true proportions. Below, the dress was full, and sufficiently showed that parsimony in attire was not a foible of the day. A small loop displayed the beauty of the fabric to advantage, and aided in giving majesty to the figure. The tall stature of the lady was heightened by shoes of the same material with the dress, whose heels added more than an inch to the liberality of nature. The sleeves were short, and close to the limb, until they fell off at the elbows in large ruffles, that hung in rich profusion from the arm when extended, and duplicates and triplicates of lawn, trimmed with Dresden lace, lent their aid in giving delicacy to a hand and arm that yet retained their whiteness and symmetry. A treble row of large pearls closely encircled her throat, and a handkerchief of lace partially concealed that part of the person that the silk had left exposed, but which the experience of 40 years had warned Miss Peyton should now be veiled. Thus attired, and standing erect with the lofty grace that distinguished the manners of that day, the maiden would have looked into nothingness a bevy of modern belles. The taste of Sarah had kept even pace with the decorations of her aunt, and a dress, differing in no respect from the one just described but in material and tints, exhibited her imposing form to equal advantage. The satin of her robe was of a pale bluish color. 20 years did not, however, require the screen that was prudent in 40, and nothing in an envious border of exquisite lace hid, in some measure, what the satin left exposed to view. The upper part of the bust and the fine fall of the shoulders were blazing in all their native beauty, and like the aunt, the throat was ornamented by a treble row of pearls, to correspond with which were rings of the same quality in the ears. The head was without a cap, and the hair drawn up from the countenance so as to give to the eye all the loveliness of a forehead as polished as marble and as white as snow. A few straggling curls fell gracefully on the neck, and a bouquet of artificial flowers was also placed, like a coronet, over her brow. Miss Singleton had resigned her brother to the advice of Dr. Sitgreaves, who had succeeded in getting his patient into a deep sleep after quieting certain feverish symptoms that followed the agitation of the interview. The sister was persuaded by the observant mistress of the mansion to make one of the party, and she sat by the side of Sarah, differing but little in appearance from that lady, except in refusing the use of powder on her raven locks, and that her unusually high forehead and large, brilliant eyes gave an expression of thoughtfulness to her features that was possibly heightened by the paleness of her cheek. Last and least, but not the most unlovely in this display of female charms, was the youngest daughter of Mr. Wharton. Frances, we have already mentioned, left the city before she had attained the age of fashionable womanhood. A few adventurous spirits were already beginning to make inroads in those customs which had so long invaded the comforts of the fair sex, and the youthful girl had ventured to trust her beauty to the height which nature had bestowed. This was but little, but that little was a masterpiece. Frances several times had determined, in the course of the morning, to bestow more than usual pains in the decoration of her person. Each time in succession, as she formed this resolution, she spent a few minutes in looking earnestly towards the north, and then she as invariably changed it. At the appointed hour, our heroine appeared in the drawing-room, clothed in a robe of pale blue silk, of a cut and fashion much like that worn by her sister. Her hair was left to the wild curls of nature, its exuberance being confined to the crown of her head by a long, low comb, made of light tortoise-shell, a color barely distinguishable in the golden hue of her tresses. Her dress was without a plait or a wrinkle, and fitted the form with an exactitude that might lead one to imagine the arch girl more than suspected the beauties it displayed. A tucker of rich Dresden lace softened the contour of the figure. Her head was without ornament, but around her throat was a necklace of gold, clasped in the front with a rich cornelian. Once, and only once, as they moved toward the repast, did Lawton see a foot thrust itself from beneath the folds of her robe, and exhibit its little beauties encased in a slipper of blue silk, clasped close to the shape by a buckle of brilliants. The trooper caught himself sighing as he thought, though it was good for nothing in the stirrup, how enchantingly it would grace a minuet. As the black appeared on the threshold of the room, making a low reverence, which has been interpreted for some centuries into dinner waits, Mr. Wharton, clad in a dress of drab, bedecked with enormous buttons, advanced formally to Miss Singleton, and bending his powdered head nearly to the level of the hand he extended, received hers in return. Dr. Sitgreaves offered the same homage to Miss Peyton, and met with equal favour, the lady first pausing to draw on her gloves. Colonel Wellmere was honoured with a smile from Sarah while performing a similar duty, and Frances gave the ends of her taper fingers to Captain Lawton with maiden bashfulness. Much time and some trouble were expended before the whole party were, to the great joy of Caesar, comfortably arranged around the table, with proper attention to all points of etiquette and precedence. The black well knew the viands were not improving, and though abundantly able to comprehend the disadvantage of eating a cold dinner, it greatly exceeded his powers of philosophy to weigh all the latent consequences to society which depended on social order. Much time and some trouble were expended before the whole party were, to the great joy of Caesar, comfortably arranged around the table, with proper attention to all points of etiquette and precedence. Dr. Sitgreaves offered the same homage to Miss Peyton, and met with equal favour, the lady first pausing to draw on her gloves. The black well knew the viands were not improving, and though abundantly able to comprehend the disadvantage of eating a cold dinner, it greatly exceeded his powers of philosophy to weigh all the latent consequences to society which depend on social order. For the first 10 minutes all but the captain of dragoons found themselves in a situation much to their liking. Even Lawton would have been perfectly happy, had not excess of civility on the part of his host and Miss Jeanette Peyton kept him from the more agreeable occupation of tasting dishes he did want, in order to decline those he did not. At length, however, the repast was fairly commenced, and a devoted application on the viands was more eloquent than 1,000 words in favour of Dinah's skill. Next came drinking with the ladies, but as the wine was excellent and the glasses ample, the trooper bore this interruption with consummate good nature. Nay, so fearful was he of giving offence, and of omitting any of the nicer points of punctilio, that having commenced this courtesy with the lady who sat next to him, he persevered until not one of his fair companions could, with justice, reproach him with partiality in this particular. Long abstemiousness from anything like generous wine might plead the excuse of Captain Lawton, especially when exposed to so strong a temptation as that now before him. Mr. Wharton had been one of a set of politicians in New York, whose principal exploits before the war had been to assemble, and to pass sage opinions on, the signs of the times, under the inspiration of certain liquor made from a grape that grew on the south side of the island of Madeira, and which found its way into the colonies of North America through the medium of the West Indies, sojourning a while in the western archipelago, by way of proving the virtues of the climate. A large supply of this cordial had been drawn from his storehouse in the city, and some of it now sparkled in a bottle before the captain, blushing in the rays of the sun which were passing obliquely through it like amber. Though the meat and vegetables had made their entrance with perfect order and propriety, their exeunt was effected much in the manner of the retreat of militia. The point was to clear the board something after the fabled practice of the harpies, and by dint of scrambling, tossing, breaking, and spilling, the remnants of the overflowing repast disappeared. And now another series of processions commenced, by virtue of which a goodly display of pastry, with its usual accompaniments, garnished the table. Mr. Wharton poured out a glass of wine for the lady who sat on his right hand, and pushing the bottle to a guest, said with a low bow, "We are to be honoured with a toast from Miss Singleton." Although there was nothing more in this movement than occurred every day on such occasions, yet the lady trembled, coloured, and grew pale again, seemingly endeavouring to rally her thoughts, until, by her agitation, she had excited the interest of the whole party, when by an effort, and in a manner as if she had striven in vain to think of another, Isabella said faintly, "Major Dunwoodie." The health was drunk cheerfully by all but Colonel Wellmere, who wet his lips, and drew figures on the table with some of the liquor he had spilled. At length Colonel Wellmere broke silence by saying aloud to Captain Lawton, "I suppose, sir, this Mr. Dunwoodie will receive promotion in the rebel army, for the advantage my misfortune gave him over my command." The trooper had supplied the wants of nature to his perfect satisfaction, and perhaps, with the exception of Washington and his immediate commander, there was no mortal whose displeasure he regarded a tittle. First helping himself therefore to a little of his favourite bottle, he replied with admirable coolness, "Colonel Wellmere, your pardon. Major Dunwoodie owes his allegiance to the Confederated States of North America, and where he owes it he pays it. Such a man is no rebel. Promoted I hope he may be, both because he deserves it, and because I am next in rank in the corps, and I know not what you call a misfortune unless you deem meeting the Virginia horse as such." "We will not differ about terms, sir," said the colonel haughtily. "I spoke as duty to my sovereign prompted, but do you not call the loss of a commander a misfortune to a party?" "It certainly may be so," said the trooper with emphasis. "Miss Peyton, will you favour us with a toast?" cried the master of the house, anxious to stop this dialogue. The lady bowed her head with dignity as she named General Montrose, and the long absent bloom stole lightly over her features. "There is no term more doubtful than that word misfortune," said the surgeon, regardless of the nice manoeuvres of the host. "Some deem one thing a misfortune, others its opposite. Misfortune begets misfortune. Life is a misfortune, for it may be the means of enduring misfortune. And death is a misfortune, as it abridges the enjoyments of life." "It is a misfortune that our mess has no wine such as this," interrupted the trooper. "We will pledge you a sentiment in it, sir, as seems to suit your taste," said Mr. Wharton. Lawton filled to the brim and drank. "A speedy peace, or a stirring war." "I drink your toast, Captain Lawton, though I greatly distrust your construction of activity," said the surgeon. "In my poor judgment, cavalry should be kept in the rear to improve a victory, and not sent in front to gain it. Such may be said to be their natural occupation, if the term can be used in reference to so artificial a body, for all history shows that the horse have done the most when held in reserve." This dissertation, uttered in a sufficiently didactic manner, was a hint that Miss Peyton did not neglect. She arose and retired, followed by her juniors. Nearly at the same moment, Mr. Wharton and his son made an apology for their absence, which was required on the account of the death of a near neighbour, and withdrew. The retreat of the ladies was the signal for the appearance of the surgeon's cigar, which, being established in a corner of his mouth, in a certain knowing way, caused not the slightest interruption to his discourse. "If anything can sweeten captivity and wounds, it must be the happiness of suffering in the society of the ladies who have left us," gallantly observed the colonel, as he resumed his seat after closing the door. "Sympathy and kindness have their influence on the human system," returned the surgeon, knocking the ashes from his cigar, with the tip of a little finger, in the manner of an adept. "The connection is intimate between the moral and physical feelings, but still, to accomplish a cure, and restore nature to the healthy tone it has lost from disease or accident, requires more than can flow from unguided sympathies. In such cases, the lights—" The surgeon accidentally caught the eye of the trooper, and he paused. Taking 2 or 3 hasty puffs, he essayed to finish the sentence. "In such cases, the knowledge that flows from the lights—" "You were saying," said Colonel Wellmere, sipping his wine. "The purport of my remark went to say," continued Sitgreaves, turning his back on Lawton, "that a bread poultice would not set a broken arm." "More's the pity," cried the trooper, "for next to eating, the nourishment could not be more innocently applied." "To you, Colonel Wellmere," said the surgeon, "as a man of education, I can with safety appeal." The colonel bowed. "You must have observed the dreadful havoc made in your ranks by the men who were led by this gentleman." The colonel looked grave again. "How, when blows lighted on their frame, life was invariably extinguished beyond all hope of scientific reparation. How certain yawning wounds were inflicted, that must set at defiance to the art of the most experienced practitioner. Now, sir, to you I triumphantly appeal, therefore, to know whether your detachment would not have been as effectually defeated if the men had all lost a right arm, for instance, as if they had all lost their heads." "The triumph of your appeal is somewhat hasty, sir," said Wellmere. "Is the cause of liberty advanced a step by such injudicious harshness in the field?" continued the surgeon, bent on the favourite principle of his life. "I am yet to learn that the cause of liberty is in any manner advanced by the services of any gentleman in the rebel army," rejoined the colonel. "Not liberty! Good God, for what, then, are we contending?" "Slavery, sir. Yes, even slavery. You are putting the tyranny of a mob on the throne of a kind and lenient prince. Where is the consistency of your boasted liberty?" "Consistency!" repeated the surgeon, looking about him a little wildly, at hearing such charges against a cause he had so long thought holy. "Ay, sir, your consistency. Your Congress of Sages have published a manifesto, wherein they have set forth the equality of political rights. 'Tis true, and it is done most ably. I say nothing of its ability, but if true, why not set your slaves at liberty? This argument, which is thought by most of the colonel's countrymen a triumphant answer to 1,000 eloquent facts, lost none of its weight by the manner in which it was uttered. Every American feels humbled at the necessity of vindicating his country from the apparent inconsistency and injustice of the laws alluded to. His feelings are much like those of an honorable man who is compelled to exonerate himself from a disgraceful charge, although he may know the accusation to be false. At the bottom, Sitgreaves had much good sense, and thus called upon he took up the cudgel's argument in downright earnest. "We deem it a liberty to have the deciding voice in the councils by which we are governed. We think it a hardship to be ruled by the king of a people who live at a distance of 3,000 miles, and who cannot, and who do not, feel a single political interest in common with ourselves. I say nothing of oppression. The child was of age, and was entitled to the privileges of majority. In such cases there is but one tribunal to which to appeal for a nation's rights. It is power, and we now make the appeal." "Such doctrines may suit your present purposes," said Wellmere, with a sneer, "but I apprehend it is opposed to all the opinions and practices of civilized nations." "It is in conformity with the practices of all nations," said the surgeon, returning the nod and smile of Lawton, who enjoyed the good sense of his comrade as much as he disliked what he called his medical talk. "Who would be ruled when he can rule? The only rational ground to take is, that every community has a right to govern itself, so that in no manner it violates the laws of God." "And is holding your fellow creatures in bondage in conformity to those laws?" asked the colonel, impressively. The surgeon took another glass, and hemming once, returned to the combat. "Sir," he said, "slavery is of very ancient origin, and it seems to have been confined to no particular religion or form of government. Every nation of civilized Europe does, or has held, their fellow creatures in this kind of duress." "You will accept Great Britain!" cried the colonel, proudly. "No, sir," continued the surgeon, confidently, feeling that he was now carrying the war out of his own country. "I cannot accept Great Britain. It was her children, her ships, and her laws, that first introduced the practice into these states, and on her institutions the judgment must fall. There is not a foot of ground belonging to England in which a negro would be useful that has not its slave. England herself has none, but England is overflowing with physical force, a part of which she is obliged to maintain in the shape of paupers. The same is true of France and most other European countries. So long as we were content to remain colonies, nothing was said of our system of domestic slavery. But now, when we are resolute to obtain as much freedom as the vicious system of metropolitan rule has left us, that which is England's gift has become our reproach. Will your master liberate the slaves of his subjects, should he succeed in subduing the new states? Or will he condemn the whites to the same servitude as that in which he has been so long content to see the blacks? It is true we continue the practice, but we must come gradually to the remedy, or create an evil greater than that which we endure at present. Doubtless, as we advance, the manumission of our slaves will accompany us, until happily these fair regions shall exist without a single image of the Creator that is held in a state which disqualifies him to judge of that Creator's goodness. It will be remembered that Dr. Sitgreaves spoke 40 years ago, and Wellmere was unable to contradict his prophetic assertion. Finding the subject getting to be knotty, the Englishman retired to the apartment in which the ladies had assembled, and seated by the side of Sarah, he found a more pleasing employment in relating the events of fashionable life in the metropolis, and in recalling the thousand little anecdotes of their former associates. Miss Peyton was a pleased listener as she dispensed the bounties of the tea-table, and Sarah frequently bowed her blushing countenance to her needlework, as her face glowed at the flattering remarks of her companion. The dialogue we have related established a perfect truce between the surgeon and his comrade, and the former having paid a visit to Singleton, they took their leave of the ladies and mounted, the former to visit the wounded at the encampment, and the latter to rejoin his troop. But their movements were arrested at the gate by an occurrence that we shall relate in the next chapter. End of chapter 13.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kim Zuckert, Tales of the Brass Hedgehog, at hedgehog.net. The Spy, by James Fenimore Cooper, Chapter 14. I see no more those white locks thinly spread round the bald polish of that honored head, no more that meek, that supplicant look in prayer, nor that pure faith that gave it force are there. But he is blessed, and I lament no more, a wise, good man, contented to be poor. Crabbe. We have already said that the customs of America leave the dead but a short time in sight of the mourners, and the necessity of providing for his own safety had compelled the peddler to abridge even this brief space. In the confusion and agitation produced by the events we have recorded, the death of the elder Birch had occurred unnoticed, but a sufficient number of the immediate neighbors were hastily collected, and the ordinary rites of sepulture were now about to be paid to the deceased. It was the approach of this humble procession that arrested the movements of the trooper and his comrade. 4 men supported the body on a rude bier, and 4 others walked in advance, ready to relieve their friends from their burden. The peddler walked next to the coffin, and by his side moved Katy Haynes, with the most determined aspect of woe, and next to the mourners came Mr. Wharton and the English captain. 2 or 3 old men and women, with a few straggling boys, brought up the rear. Captain Lawson sat in his saddle, in rigid silence, until the bearers came opposite to his position, and then, for the first time, Harvey raised his eyes from the ground and saw the enemy that he had dreaded so near him. The first impulse of the peddler was certainly flight, but recovering his recollection, he fixed his eye on the coffin of his parent, and passed the dragoon with a firm step but swelling heart. The trooper slowly lifted his cap, and continued uncovered until Mr. Wharton and his son had moved by. when, accompanied by the surgeon, he rode leisurely in the rear, maintaining an inflexible silence. Caesar emerged from the cellar kitchen of the cottage, and with a face of settled solemnity added himself to the number of the followers of the funeral, though with a humble mien, and at a most respectful distance from the horsemen. The old negro had placed around his arm, a little above the elbow, a napkin of unsullied whiteness, it being the only time since his departure from the city that he had enjoyed an opportunity of exhibiting himself in the garniture of servile mourning. He was a great lover of propriety, and had been a little stimulated to this display by a desire to show his sable friend from Georgia all the decencies of a New York funeral, and the ebullition of his zeal went off very well, producing no other result than a mild lecture from Miss Peyton at his return on the fitness of things. The attendance of the black was thought well enough in itself, but the napkin was deemed a superfluous exhibition of ceremony at the funeral of a man who had performed all the menial offices in his own person. The graveyard was an enclosure on the grounds of Mr. Wharton, which had been fenced with stone and set apart for the purpose by that gentleman some years before. It was not, however, intended as a burial place for any of his own family. Until the fire, which raged as the British troops took possession of New York, had laid Trinity in ashes, a goodly gilded tablet on its walls proclaimed the virtues of his deceased parents, and beneath a flag of marble in one of the aisles of the church their bones were left to moulder in aristocratical repose. Captain Lawton made a movement as if he was disposed to follow the procession when it left the highway, to enter the field which contained the graves of the humble dead, but he was recalled to recollection by a hint from his companion that he was taking the wrong road. "Of all the various methods which have been adopted by man for the disposal of his earthly remains, which do you prefer, Captain Lawton?" said the surgeon, as they separated from the little procession. "In some countries the body is exposed to be devoured by wild beasts. In others it is suspended in the air to exhale its substance in the manner of decomposition. In other regions it is consumed on the funeral pyre, and again it is inhumed in the bowels of the earth. Every people have their own particular fashion. And to which do you give the preference?" "All are agreeable," said the trooper, following the group they had left with his eyes, "though the speediest interments give the cleanest fields. Of which are you an admirer?" "The last, as practised by ourselves, but the other three are destructive of all the opportunities for dissection, whereas in the last the coffin can lie in peaceful decency, while the remains are made to subserve the useful purposes of science. Ah, Captain Lawson, I enjoy comparatively but few opportunities of such a nature to what I expected upon entering the army." "To what may these pleasures numerically amount in a year?" said the captain, withdrawing his gaze from the graveyard. "Within a dozen, upon my honor. My best picking is when the corps is detached, for when we are with the main army there are so many boys to be satisfied that I seldom get a good subject. Those youngsters are as wasteful as prodigals and as greedy as vultures." "A dozen!" echoed the trooper in surprise. "Why, I furnish you that number with my own hands." "Ah, Jack," returned the doctor, approaching the subject with great tenderness of manner, "it is seldom I can do anything with your patients. You disfigure them woefully. Believe me, John, when I tell you as a friend that your system is all wrong. You unnecessarily destroy life, and then you injure the body so it is unfit for the only use that can be made of a dead man." The trooper maintained a silence, which he thought would be the most probable means of preserving peace between them, and the surgeon, turning his head from taking a last look at the burial, as they rode round the foot of the hill that shut the valley from their sight, continued with a suppressed sigh, "One might get a natural death from that graveyard tonight, if there was but time and opportunity. The patient must be the father of the lady we saw this morning." "The petticoat doctor, she with the aurora borealis complexion," said the trooper with a smile that began to cause uneasiness to his companion. "But the lady was not the gentleman's daughter, only his medico-petticoat attendant, and the Harvey, whose name was made to rhyme with every word in her song, is the renowned peddler's spy." "What? He who unhorsed you?" "No man ever unhorsed me, Dr. Sitgreaves," said the dragoon, gravely. "I fell by mischance of Roanoke. Rider and beast kissed the earth together." "A warm embrace from the love spots it left on your cuticle. 'Tis a thousand pities that you cannot find where the tattling rascal lies hid." "He followed his father's body." "And you let him pass!" cried the surgeon, checking his horse. "Let us return immediately and take him. Tomorrow you shall have him hanged, Jack, and damn me, I'll dissect him." "Softly, softly, my dear Archibald. Would you arrest a man while paying the last offices to a dead father? Leave him to me, and I pledge myself he shall have justice." The doctor muttered his dissatisfaction at any postponement of vengeance, but he was compelled to acquiesce, from a regard to his reputation for propriety, and they continued their ride to the quarters of the corps, engaged in various discussions concerning the welfare of the human body. Birch supported the grave and collected manner that was thought becoming in a male mourner on such occasions, and to Katy was left the part of exhibiting the tenderness of the softer sex. There are some people whose feelings are of such nature that they cannot weep unless it be in proper company, and the spinster was a good deal addicted to this congregational virtue. After casting her eyes around the small assemblage, the housekeeper found the countenances of the few females who were present fixed on her in solemn expectation, and the effect was instantaneous. The maiden really wept, and she gained no inconsiderable sympathy and some reputation for a tender heart from the spectators. The muscles of the peddler's face were seen to move, and as the first clod of earth fell on the tenement of his father, sending up that dull, hollow sound that speaks so eloquently the mortality of man, his whole frame was for an instant convulsed. He bent his body down, as if in pain. His fingers worked while the hands hung lifeless by his side, and there was an expression in his countenance that seemed to announce a writhing of the soul, but it was not unresisted, and it was transient. He stood erect, drew a long breath, and looked around him with an elevated face that even seemed to smile with the consciousness of having obtained the mastery. The grave was soon filled. A rough stone, placed at either extremity, marked its position, and the turf, whose faded vegetation was adapted to the fortunes of the deceased, covered the little hillock with the last office of seemliness. This office ended, the neighbors, who had officiously pressed forward to offer their services in performing their solemn duty, paused, and, lifting their hats, stood looking towards the mourner, who now felt himself to be really alone in the world. Uncovering his head also, the peddler hesitated a moment to gather energy, and spoke. "My friends and neighbors," he said, "I thank you for assisting me to bury my dead out of my sight." A solemn pause succeeded the customary address, and the group dispersed in silence, some few walking with the mourners back to their own habitation, but respectfully leaving them at its entrance. The peddler and Katy were followed into the building by one man, however, who was well known to the surrounding county by the significant term of a speculator. Katy saw him enter, with a heart that palpitated with dreadful forebodings, but Harvey civilly handed him a chair, and evidently was prepared for the visit. The peddler went to the door, and, taking a cautious glance about the valley, quickly returned, and commenced the following dialogue. "The sun has just left the top of the eastern hill. My time presses me. Here is the deed for the house and lot. Everything is done according to law." The other took the paper, and conned its contents with a deliberation that proceeded partly from his caution, and partly from the unlucky circumstance of his education having been much neglected when a youth. The time occupied in this tedious examination was employed by Harvey in the gathering together certain articles which he intended to include in the stores that were to leave the habitation with himself. Katy had already inquired of the peddler whether the deceased had left a will, and she saw the Bible placed in the bottom of a new pack, which she had made for his accommodation, with a most stoical indifference. But as the 6 silver spoons were laid carefully by its side, a sudden twinge of her conscience objected to such a palpable waste of property, and she broke silence. "When you marry, Harvey, you may miss those spoons." "I shall never marry." "Well, if you don't, there's no occasion to make rash promises, even to yourself. One never knows what one may do. In such a case, I should like to know of what use so many spoons can be to a single man. For my part, I think it is a duty for every man who is well provided to have a wife and family to maintain." At the time when Katy expressed this sentiment, the fortune of women in her class of life consisted of a cow, a bed, the labors of their own hands in the shape of divers pillow-cases, blankets, and sheets, with, where fortune was unusually kind, a half-dozen silver spoons. The spinster herself had obtained all the other necessities by her own industry and prudence, and it can be easily imagined that she saw the articles she had long counted her own vanish in the enormous pack, with a dissatisfaction that was in no degree diminished by the declaration that had preceded the act. Harvey, however, disregarded her opinions and feelings, and continued his employment of filling the pack, which soon grew to something like the ordinary size of the peddler's burden. "I'm rather timorsome about this conveyance," said the purchaser, having at length waded through the covenants of the deed. "Why so?" "I'm afraid it won't stand good in law. I know that 2 of the neighbors leave home tomorrow morning to have the place entered for confiscation, and if I should give £40 and lose it all, 'twould be a dead pull back to me." "They can only take my right," said the peddler. "Pay me $200, and the house is yours. You are a well-known Whig, and you at least they won't trouble." As Harvey spoke, there was a strange bitterness of manner, mingled with the shrewd care he expressed concerning the sale of his property. "Say 100, and it's a bargain," returned the man, with a grin that he meant for a good-natured smile. "A bargain?" echoed the peddler in surprise. "I thought the bargain already made." "Nothing is a bargain," said the purchaser with a chuckle, "until papers are delivered and the money paid in hand." "You have the paper." "Ah, and will keep it, if you will excuse the money." "Come, say 150, and I won't be hard. Here is just the money." The peddler looked from the window, and saw with dismay that the evening was fast advancing, and knew well that he endangered his life by remaining in the dwelling after dark. Yet he could not tolerate the idea of being defrauded in this manner, in a bargain that had already been fairly made, and he hesitated. "Well," said the purchaser, rising, "mayhap you can find another man to trade with between this and morning, but if you don't, your title won't be worth much afterwards." "Take it, Harvey," said Katy, who felt it impossible to resist a tender like the one before her, for the purchase money was in English guineas. Her voice roused the peddler, and a new idea seemed to strike him. "I agree to the price," he said, and turning to the spinster, he placed part of the money in her hand, and as he continued, "Had I other means to pay you, I would have lost all, rather than suffer myself to be defrauded of part." "You may lose all yet," muttered the stranger with a sneer, as he rose and left the building. "Yes," said Katy, following him with her eyes. "He knows you're failing, Harvey. He thinks with me, now the old gentleman is gone, you will want a careful body to take care of your concerns." The peddler was busied in making arrangements for his departure, and he took no notice of this insinuation, while the spinster returned again to the attack. She had lived for so many years in expectation of a termination to her hopes, so different from that which now seemed likely to occur, that the idea of separation began to give her more uneasiness than she had thought herself capable of feeling about a man so destitute and friendless. "Have you another house to go to?" inquired Katy. "Providence will provide me with a home." "Yes," said the housekeeper, "but maybe 'twill not be to your liking." "The poor must not be difficult." "I'm sure I'm anything but a difficult body," cried the spinster, very hastily, "but I love to see things becoming and in their places, yet I wouldn't be hard to persuade to leave this place myself. I can't say I altogether like the ways of the people hereabouts." "The valley is lovely," said the peddler with fervor, "and the people like all the race of man. But to me it matters nothing. All places are now alike, and all faces equally strange." As he spoke, he dropped the article he was packing from his hand, and seated himself on a chest with a look of vacant misery. "Not so, not so," said Katy, shoving her chair nearer to the place where the peddler sat. "Not so, Harvey. You must know me, at least. My face cannot be strange to you." Birch turned his eyes slowly on her countenance, which exhibited more of feeling and less of self than he had ever seen there before. He took her hand kindly, and his own features lost some of their painful expression as he said, "Yes, good woman, you at least are not a stranger to me. You may do me partial justice. When others revile me, possibly your feelings may lead you to say something in my defense." "That I will, that I would," said Katy, eagerly. "I will defend you, Harvey, to the last drop. Let me hear them that dare to revile you. You say true, Harvey, I am partial and just to you. What if you do like the king? I have often heard it said he was at the bottom a good man, but there's no religion in the old country, for everyone allows the ministers are desperate bad." The peddler paced the floor in evident distress of mind. His eyes had a look of wildness that Katy had never witnessed before, and his step was measured, with a dignity that appalled the housekeeper. "While my father lived," murmured Harvey, unable to smother his feelings, "there was one who read my heart. And oh, what a consolation to return from my secret marches of danger, and the insults and wrongs that I suffered, to receive his blessing and his praise. But he is gone," he continued, stopping and gazing wildly towards the corner that used to hold the figure of his parent. "And who is there to do me justice?" "Why, Harvey, Harvey!" "Yes, there is one who will, and who must know me before I die. Oh, it is dreadful to die and leave such a name behind me." "Don't talk of dying, Harvey," said the spinster, glancing her eye around the room, and pushing the wood in the fire to obtain a light from the blaze. The ebullition of feeling in the peddler was over. It had been excited by the events of the past day, and a vivid perception of his sufferings. It was not long, however, that passion maintained an ascendancy ever the reason of this singular man, and perceiving that the night had already thrown an obscurity around objects without doors, he hastily threw his pack over his shoulders, and taking Katy kindly by the hand, in leave-taking. "It is painful to part with even you, good woman," he said, "but the hour has come, and I must go. What is left in the house is yours. To me it could be of no use, and it may serve to make you more comfortable. Farewell. We shall meet hereafter." "In the regions of darkness!" cried a voice that caused the peddler to sink on the chest from which he had fallen in despair. "What! Another pack, Mr. Birch, and so well stuffed so soon?" "Have you not done evil enough?" cried the peddler, regaining his firmness, and springing to his feet with energy. "Is it not enough to harass the last moments of a dying man, to impoverish me? What more would you have?" "Your blood," said the Skinner, with cool malignity. "And for money," cried Harvey, bitterly, "like the ancient Judas, you would grow rich with the price of blood. Aye, and a fair price it is, my gentleman. 50 guineas, nearly the weight of that carcass of yours in gold." "Here," said Katy, promptly, "here are 15 guineas, and these drawers and this bed are all mine. If you will give Harvey but 1 hour's start from the door, they shall be yours." "1 hour," said the Skinner, showing his teeth, and looking with a longing eye at the money. "But a single hour. Here, take the money." "Hold!" cried Harvey, "put no faith in the miscreant." "She may do what she pleases with her faith," said the Skinner, with malignant pleasure, "but I have the money in good keeping. As for you, Mr. Birch, we will bear your insolence for the 50 guineas that are to pay for your gallows." "Go on," said the peddler, proudly. "Take me to Major Dunwoodie. He at least may be kind, although just." "I can do better than by marching so far in such disgraceful company. This Mr. Dunwoodie has let 1 or 2 Tories go at large, but the troop of Captain Lawton is quartered some half-mile nearer, and his receipt will get me the reward as soon as his major's. How relish you the idea of supping with Captain Lawton this evening, Mr. Birch?" "Give me my money, or set Harvey free!" cried the spinster in alarm. "Your bribe was not enough, good woman, unless there is money in this bed." Thrusting his bayonet through the ticking, and ripping it for some distance, he took a malicious satisfaction in scattering its contents about the room. "If," cried the housekeeper, losing sight of her personal danger and care for her newly acquired propriety, "there is law in the land, I will be righted." "The law of the neutral ground is the law of the strongest, but your tongue is not as long as my bayonet. You had, therefore, best not set them at loggerheads, or you might be the loser." A figure stood in the shadow of the door, as if afraid to be seen in the group of Skinners, but a blaze of light, raised by some articles thrown in the fire by his persecutors, showed the peddler the face of the purchaser of his little domain. Occasionally there was some whispering between this man and the Skinner nearest him, that induced Harvey to suspect he had been the dupe of a contrivance in which that wretch had participated. It was, however, too late to repine, and he followed the party from the house with a firm and collected tread, as if marching to a triumph, and not to a gallows. In passing through the yard, the leader of the band fell over a billet of wood, and received a momentary hurt from the fall. Exasperated at the incident, the fellow sprang on his feet, filling the air with execrations. "The curse of heaven light on the log!" he exclaimed. "The night is too dark for us to move in. Throw that brand of fire in yon pile of tow to light up the scene. "Hold!" roared the speculator. "You'll fire the house." "And see the farther," said the other, hurling the brand in the midst of the combustibles. In an instant the building was in flames. "Come on! Let us move toward the heights while we still have light to pick our road." "Villain!" cried the exasperated purchaser, "is this your friendship? This my reward for kidnapping the peddler?" "'Twould be wise to move more from the light if you mean to entertain us with abuse, or we may see too well to miss our mark," cried the leader of the gang. The next instant he was as good as his threat, but happily missed the terrified speculator, an equally appalled spinster, who saw herself again reduced from comparative wealth to poverty by the blow. Prudence dictated to the pair a speedy retreat, and the next morning the only remains of the dwelling of the peddler was the huge chimney we have already mentioned. End of chapter 14.